Need to tell you something I've never told anyone in full. Not my coworkers. Not the guys I've known since college. Not even my mother, who I called every Sunday for 30 years. I'm telling it now, because enough time has passed that I can say it without my hands shaking. My wife and I met at a hardware store. I know that's not romantic. She was trying to reach a box of tile grout on a high shelf, and I handed it to her without thinking much about it, and she looked at me like I'd done something remarkable. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony in her aunt's backyard in Flagstaff. I wore a borrowed tie. She wore her grandmother's earrings. That was 21 years ago. For most of those 21 years, I believed we had something real, not perfect. We argued about money, about the way I worked too much, about how she felt invisible sometimes, about how I didn't always know how to fix that. But real, the kind of marriage where you fight and then sit together on the back porch afterward, not quite ready to go inside. And that silence feels more honest than anything you said during the argument. I was 44 years old when I found out I had been wrong about almost all of it. Our daughter Iris was 12 that spring. She was in the phase where she still needed me in the obvious ways. Rides to school, help with history projects, someone to fix the Wi-Fi when it went down, but was also starting to drift toward her own world. I loved that world. I'd sit at the kitchen table pretending to read while she did homework, just to be near her. She had her mother's focus and my tendency to hum to herself when she was thinking hard. I used to listen for it. My wife had been different for about 8 months by then. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would make a good movie scene. Just quieter, more phone in hand. Coming to bed later. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd say she was fine, or tired, or going through something she couldn't quite name. I didn't push. Looking back, I wish I had pushed, but I was trying to give her space the way she'd always asked me to, and I told myself that was the right thing. Her brother Dwight had always been part of our lives. He lived 40 minutes away, ran a small contracting business, came to Iris's birthday parties and Christmas dinners. I trusted him the way you trust furniture, automatically, without examination. He and my wife talked often, and never thought anything of it. It was a contractor friend of mine named Mitch who first made me uneasy. We were on a job site in March, sharing bad coffee out of a thermos, and he mentioned he'd seen my wife's car outside Dwight's place twice that week, midday. Both times for a couple of hours. He said it carefully, the way people say things they don't want to be the one to say. I thanked him and changed the subject, but I drove home that night with something sitting in my chest that I couldn't shake loose. I want to be precise about what I did next because I think it matters. I didn't blow up. I didn't confront her that night over dinner while Iris was at the table. I sat with it for 3 days. I went back through things in my mind. The phone, the hours, the distance, the way she flinched slightly when I came up behind her too quietly. And I made an appointment with an attorney named Carver who a colleague had recommended years ago for a contract dispute. I sat in Carver's office on a Tuesday morning, and I told him I thought my marriage was in trouble, and I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before anything happened. He was a quiet man with a habit of clicking his pen. He listened. He told me the first thing I should do was understand what we owned, jointly, separately, where things stood legally. He also said gently that if I had concerns, I should document everything I could and do it quietly. I had a will. I'd made it years ago, shortly after Iris was born, the kind of thing you do when you become a parent and suddenly understand that you could stop existing. It left everything to my wife, with provisions for Iris's care. Standard. Sentimental. Carver looked at it and suggested I update it. Not because anything was wrong, he said, but because it was old and things change. People change. We scheduled a follow-up for 3 weeks out to draw up a new one. I didn't tell my wife about that appointment. What I found out later, what I found out in the worst possible way, was that I should have been afraid of something I hadn't even imagined. In April, my wife told me she needed to go visit Dwight for the weekend. Something about helping him with paperwork for his business. She took Iris. I said fine. I stayed home. I told myself I was being patient. She came back Sunday evening looking like a woman who had decided something. I noticed it, but I didn't know what it meant yet. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Carver. He sounded different than usual. He asked me to come in. I sat down across from him and he put a document on the desk. It was a copy of a will. My will, supposedly. My name on it, my signature at the bottom. But I had never seen it before in my life. The date on it was from 3 weeks earlier. The beneficiary was not my wife. It was Dwight, the entire estate, the house, my retirement, Iris's education fund, everything I had spent 20 years building, signed over to my brother-in-law. I stared at that page for a long time without speaking. Carver was the one who explained what must have happened. Someone, and the evidence would eventually be very clear about who, had obtained my signature from another document, had replicated it, and had filed a new will with the county. It was meant to be the will on record. It was meant to be what a probate court would see. What they hadn't known, what my wife and her brother did not know, was that 3 weeks before that document was filed, Carver and I had already executed a new will. Witnessed, notarized, dated, logged in his office system. Already on file, the fraudulent will, filed second, directly conflicted with a legitimate document already in existence. Any attorney looking at it would see the problem immediately. Any judge would see it within minutes. The signature was a forgery. The notary stamp on the fraudulent version turned out to be from a notary who had moved out of state 2 years prior and whose commission had lapsed. It was, in Carver's words, an amateur attempt at something that required a professional. I drove home that evening and I cooked dinner. I made the pasta dish Iris likes with the garlic bread. I helped her with an essay about the water cycle. I said goodnight and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark next to my wife, and I thought about 21 years. I thought about the hardware store. I thought about the borrowed tie. I thought about every Sunday I called my mother, and every Tuesday I picked up Iris from soccer, and every season I spent pouring everything I had into a life that someone in the next room had decided to dismantle. I did not sleep. The following morning I called Carver for my truck, parked 3 blocks from my house. He had already been in contact with a colleague who specialized in document fraud. The case was straightforward, he said. The forgery was evident. The question was what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to do everything. I want to say something honest here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes telling a story like this worth anything. I was not calm. I was not some composed man executing a perfect strategy. I was furious and I was gutted, and there were mornings in those weeks when I sat in my truck in parking lots for 30 minutes because I couldn't make myself move. I missed Iris's soccer game once because I was sitting in Carver's office for 3 hours, and I told her I got stuck in traffic and I felt sick about that lie. I talked to almost nobody. I ate badly. I didn't sleep through a single night, but I kept going. Because of Iris, mostly, but also because some part of me needed to understand how deep this went. It went deep. Mitch, the friend who had seen my wife's car at Dwight's, agreed to help me document comings and goings for a few weeks. Nothing dramatic, just timestamps, photos from a public street, the kind of thing that turns into a folder of evidence. What we assembled told a coherent story. My wife had been at Dwight's house regularly for months. There were financial transfers I hadn't known about, small ones, from a joint account I rarely monitored, that added up to something that looked like preparation. She had also been in contact with a man who turned out to be a notary broker, someone who connected people to notaries willing to sign documents without proper verification. That trail took longer to establish, but Carver's colleague found it. I moved out of the bedroom in May. I told Iris I was having trouble sleeping and didn't want to bother her mother. She accepted that with the pragmatic grace 12-year-olds sometimes have. She brought me a spare blanket for the guest room without being asked. I held it together until she went back to her room, and then I didn't. My wife asked me twice if something was wrong. I told her I was stressed about work. She nodded and looked almost relieved that it was something that simple. The documents were filed in the second week of June. I was not in the room when my wife was served. Carver handled the scheduling. I had taken Iris to her aunt's place for a few days under the pretense of a visit she'd been wanting to make anyway. I didn't want her home for what I knew was coming. The charges were serious. Document fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, filing a false document with the county recorder, conspiracy, because by then the evidence of Dwight's involvement was substantial enough that he was named too. His contracting business, it turned out, had been struggling for over a year. My wife had apparently decided that my estate was the solution. I've thought many times about why she did it this way. Why not divorce? We would have split things fairly. I wasn't a vindictive man. She knew that. Maybe she thought she'd get less than she wanted. Maybe Dwight had convinced her this was cleaner. Maybe something had happened in her that I'll never fully understand. Some shift where the life we built together stopped looking like hers and started looking like an obstacle. I don't know. I've stopped trying to know. What I do know is this. A judge reviewed the documents in September. The fraudulent will was immediately flagged. The legitimate will, Carver's, notarized, time-stamped, unimpeachable, made the fraudulent one irrelevant in terms of my estate. But in terms of the law, filing a forged document with the county is not a thing that gets overlooked. My wife was granted bail. Her parents, good people who I felt genuinely sorry for throughout all of this, helped her make it. She looked pale at the hearing. Dwight sat 2 rows back. He had hired his own attorney. The criminal process took the better part of a year. There were negotiations and delays and moments where Carver had to talk me through what was happening because I'd lost the thread. Eventually, my wife pled to a reduced charge. She received 3 years probation, significant fines, and a permanent mark on her record that would make any future legal career. She had always talked vaguely about going back to practice. Impossible. Dwight took it to a brief trial and did not fare as well. His involvement was documented thoroughly. He received 18 months, served 10. I filed for divorce the same week the criminal proceedings concluded. It was granted. I received the house, primary custody of Iris, the retirement accounts, the education fund. Everything that had been targeted stayed with me. Iris is 15 now. She knows more than I wish she did. Not because I told her, but because children find out things. And I decided I would rather she hear truth from me than rumors from elsewhere. We had that conversation on the back porch, the same porch where I used to sit after arguments. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me if I was okay. I told her I was getting there. She said that was good enough for now. She still hums to herself when she's thinking hard. She still has her mother's focus. She still sometimes calls from her room to ask me to fix things that aren't actually broken. And I know that means she just wants me nearby, and I always go. I've thought about what I'd say if I had to summarize what happened. What the lesson is, if there is one, I don't think it's trust no one. That seems like a sad way to live. I trusted Mitch, who told me something hard because he cared about me. I trusted Carver, who turned out to be exactly the person I needed at exactly the right time. I trusted myself enough to sit still and not blow things up before I understood them. What I think I've learned is that the life you build doesn't protect itself. You have to know what it's made of. You have to keep your paperwork in order, which sounds absurdly mundane for what I'm trying to say, but it's true. You have to update your will. You have to read your bank statements. You have to notice when things change and ask questions even when asking feels like an accusation. And you have to trust your gut when it's telling you something. Mine was quiet for too long. But when it finally spoke, I listened. And that made all the difference. People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter. I understand why they ask. It's the natural question after a story like this one. And I think about it honestly before I answer, because I think honest answers are the only ones worth giving anymore. I'm not bitter. I was, for a while. There were months where I drove to work and sat in the parking lot and felt something close to rage at the sheer waste of it. 21 years, a daughter, a life built from nothing, and someone I loved had decided to treat it like a transaction. That feeling was real, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But here's what I've come to understand. What happened to me didn't happen because the world is random or cruel or indifferent. It happened because of choices. My wife made choices. Dwight made choices. And, I have to be honest here, I made choices too. I chose to stop asking questions when the answers felt uncomfortable. I chose to give space when I should have been present. I chose for too long to mistake silence for peace. The thing about consequences is they don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, choice by choice, until one day you're sitting across from an attorney looking at a document with your forged signature on it, and the whole weight of every ignored instinct lands on you at once. That's not punishment from some outside force. That's just how the math of decisions works out over time. What saved me, and I mean that plainly, not dramatically, was that I had spent 20 years building something real. The retirement account, the house, The updated, "Will I filed with Carver 3 weeks before any of this collapsed." None of that was luck. That was showing up and doing the unglamorous work of maintaining a life. That was boring Tuesday morning responsibility, and when everything came apart, those boring Tuesdays were the only things standing between me and losing everything. I think about Iris a lot when I think about what all this taught me. She watched her father go quiet for months. She watched her family fracture. She brought me a blanket without being asked, and she asked me if I was okay when she found out the truth. 12 years old, she had more composure than I did on most days. I think that's because she's been watching closely her whole life, and what she's seen is a person who keeps going. Not perfectly, not without breaking down in truck cabs and parking lots, but keeps going. That's the only thing I know how to pass on to her. Not some polished lesson, not a formula, just the plain fact that when something hits you that you didn't see coming, the question is whether you can get still enough to think before you react, whether you can sit in the difficulty instead of blowing through it, whether you can trust the work you've already done. My wife had a sharp mind, so did Dwight. They spent months constructing something they thought was airtight. What undid them wasn't my cleverness. It was a Tuesday morning appointment I'd made for entirely ordinary reasons, and a quiet man with a clicking pen who told me to update my paperwork. The most important things usually aren't dramatic. They're just done, or they're not. I'm doing better now. Iris hums when she does her homework. I still listen for it,